Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. We have a lot to cover today, so let's just jump in. Before we move into the main stories, however, we note that yesterday, Monday, a man holding a knife attacked a bus used by a Japanese school in the wealthy eastern Chinese city of Suzhou, not too far from Shanghai, seriously wounding a Chinese woman and injuring a Japanese woman and her child waiting at the bus stop, according to an official at the Japanese consulate in Shanghai. The Japanese school was closed today, while other Japanese schools in the country, 11 in total, strengthened their security. An investigation has started, and it's unclear what the motivations behind the attack were. Concerningly, however, this is the second mass stabbing of foreigners in China in less than a few weeks. And China does not have a large foreign population. We remember from earlier this month that 4 visitors from a US college and a Chinese bystander were stabbed in a park during the day in the northeast of the country. China currently has very strained relations with both Japan and the US. We note too that last week 3 were stabbed in an attack in a Shanghai metro station, though all victims were Chinese. Now let's move into the main stories for today, and we begin with economic updates. According to official data from the Ministry of Commerce, China's foreign direct investment, FDI, fell further in May, extending a streak of declines for the 12th straight month. China attracted $56.81 billion worth of foreign direct investment in the January to May period, down 28.2% from the same period last year. That widened from the 27.9% drop recorded in the first 4 months of the year. The metric has been falling since June 2023. Regular viewers will know that the decline in FDI comes amid escalating tensions between China and the West, as well as concern for China's economy generally. There is more bad news too. According to official numbers published by the Ministry of Finance yesterday, China's fiscal revenue shrank at the fastest pace in more than a year. Total revenues fell 4.1% during the January through May period from last year to $1.6 trillion, leaving a fiscal shortfall of $300 billion, widening from the January through May period last year. US-based Bloomberg, reporting on the data, writes that the government's budget has been under strain as slowing economic growth weighed on tax income, while a multi-year property market downturn has slashed its income from land sales. Indeed, Chinese financial media outlet Yicai reports today that sales of land use rights, a key revenue stream for China's local governments, fell at a faster rate last month, deepening the decline in the first 5 months of the year to 14%. From January to May, finance revenue from land transactions dived by $176 billion from a year ago. In the first 4 months of this year, the decline was 10.4%. And we note that this is on top of a decline we already saw last year. In the first 5 months, 26 of 30 regions recorded falling sales. 15 regions logged higher than 30% decreases, including Guangdong province, which reported as high as a 57.5 percentage point drop, while Sichuan province suffered a 42.7% drop. Luo Zhihang, chief economist at Yuekai Securities, explained in a note today, quote, "The slumps have increased local governments' dependence on transfer payments from the central government, while reducing their ability to build new infrastructure and improve people's livelihoods, while urban investment companies have a harder time getting access to debt financing." End quote. As we discussed last week, local officials have become more aggressive in chasing companies for taxes dating back decades, as they try to plug a hole in their finances caused by the housing crisis. In October last year, Beijing took the rare move of adjusting its budget mid-year, raising last year's fiscal deficit to 3.8% of gross domestic product through the issuance of an additional 1 trillion yuan of sovereign bonds to aid the economy. With these poor data, we may see something similar this year. Last week, former advisor to China's central bank and outspoken economist Yu Yongding penned a widely read piece calling on China to sell additional sovereign debt this year to ensure that its full-year growth target of around 5% can be achieved. But this would mean yet another year of unbalanced growth is achieved through surging debt. Next up, we move to EU-China tensions. But just quickly, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, I have a huge favor to ask. That is just to hit the like button, and if you're not already subscribed, subscribing is also a big help. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, the growing tensions between China and the EU. German Vice-Chancellor and Minister of Economic Affairs Robert Habeck just concluded a trip to Beijing over the weekend, and preventing a full breakdown in trade was front and center in his efforts in China. Habeck's 3-day trip to China is the first by a senior European official since Brussels proposed heavy duties on imports of Chinese-made electric vehicles to combat excessive subsidies. On Friday, the first day of the trip, Beijing warned that escalating frictions with the European Union over electric vehicle imports could trigger a trade war, with a PRC Commerce Ministry spokesperson expressing, quote, "The European side continues to escalate trade frictions and could trigger a trade war. The responsibility lies entirely with the European side," end quote. As we have covered, late last week, Chinese automakers urged Beijing to hike tariffs on imported European gasoline-powered cars, and the government launched a dumping probe into EU pork imports in retaliation for the European Commission move. Germany, whose politically powerful automaking industry is heavily reliant on China's market, has been one of the few EU countries to push back heavily against the EV tariffs. Over the weekend, we learned that German exports to China in May suffered one of their biggest falls. According to the Federal Statistics Office in Berlin, German exports to China dropped 14% to €7.5 billion in May from a year earlier. UK-based The Financial Times, however, cautioned against reading too much into the sharp fall in German exports to the Middle Kingdom, because monthly trade data can vary, and the latest drop followed a 13% annual rise a month earlier. In the first 5 months of this year, total German exports to China fell only slightly to €40.3 billion, down from €40.7 billion last year. But last year's figures were more than 10% lower than 2022 levels. Interestingly, while in Beijing, the German economic minister's planned meeting with Premier Li Qiang was cancelled at the last minute without explanation. While he did not get a meeting with the Premier, he did come away with an agreement for talks to try to delay or prevent the additional tariffs. The European Commission also said that it would host so-called technical talks with PRC officials in Brussels. But a European Commission spokesperson warned, quote, "The EU side has emphasized that any negotiated outcome of the investigation must be effective in addressing the injurious subsidization," end quote. On Monday, yesterday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, in a speech to a business lobby Congress in Berlin, underscored his government's wish for a negotiated solution, saying there is still time for that, but provisional duties are set to be introduced from the 4th of July. Beijing has also offered Berlin another carrot. US-based Bloomberg reports that the PRC has suggested, quote, lowering its existing tariffs on large engine cars, i.e. luxury vehicles, in return for scrapping planned EV levies, end quote. Beijing currently imposes a 15% fee on passenger vehicles from the bloc. Deborah Elms, head of trade policy at the Heinrich Foundation, expressed to US media yesterday, quote, "The EU could always opt to postpone the imposition of tariffs pending the outcome of negotiations. As long as the two sides are making sufficient progress towards an answer, it's possible to stop the clock," end quote. The European Commission move is part of a wider global backlash against China's industrial policy. An increasing number of countries are placing tariffs and other restrictions on Chinese EVs and other strategically important industries. Indeed, now Canada has announced the start of a 30-day public consultation period to bring in tariffs on Chinese EVs. Speaking at a news conference in the Toronto region, Canadian Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland said Canada's auto industry is, quote, facing unfair competition from China's intentional, state-directed policy of overcapacity that is undermining Canada's EV sector's ability to compete in domestic and global markets, end quote. Canada has been under pressure to coordinate with a group of 7 allies on China trade policy. The vast majority of Canada's EV imports from China are Tesla Inc. vehicles produced from its Shanghai factory. Now let's turn back to the EU and their moves against Chinese EVs. I wanted to end this part with a piece published by global electric and autonomous vehicle markets expert Michael Doon with the provocative title, How China is Assisting a European Suicide. Let's examine a few excerpts. Quote, from 2005 to 2020, Chinese moves to acquire European assets were seen as quaint and curious, but not alarming. Look at that, a Chinese entrepreneur few people have heard of is now #1 shareholder of Mercedes.
Chinese automakers like Great Wall have tried to enter Europe before and had fallen on their faces. What was there to worry about? Fast forward to 2024, and sirens in Europe are now blaring. It feels to European automakers like the Chinese are everywhere, all at once. BYD, China's largest automaker, has set up 230 dealerships in 19 countries across Europe. A plant in Hungary will start producing BYD vehicles within 3 years. BYD executives say that they will reach 5% market share in Europe prior to that. SAIC will sell 300,000 MGs in Europe this year, 40% more than in 2023. Volvo delivered a record 700,000 cars globally last year and is on track to go high in 2024. Many of the vehicles were produced in one of Volvo's 3 China factories. Chery, China's largest exporter, plans to launch 3 new brands in Spain and Italy. End quote. He then moves on to the trade restrictions. Quote, think of the new European tariffs on Chinese cars like a glancing blow thrown by a fading heavyweight fighter, one that will not stop China's advance. The reality is that the Chinese are already woven into the fabric of Europe's car markets, and often in partnership with the Europeans themselves. Made-in-China EVs headed for Europe will top 500,000 units this year, 1 out of every 4 EVs sold in Europe. Chinese automakers will ship a further 400,000 gasoline-powered vehicles to Europe as well. The tariffs may be too late and too little. The Chinese are already inside, and they have all the leverage. As one Western executive put it to me this week, the Europeans are screwed. 1. China's massive scale, efficient supply chains, and extensive subsidies allow Chinese automakers to produce at 20 to 30% lower cost than competitors in Europe. The new higher tariffs will be a minor speed bump. 2. Mercedes, Volkswagen, Jaguar, Land Rover, and others have investments in Chinese companies, aligning their interests closely with China. And 3. Mercedes, Audi, and BMW are paralyzed by constant worry about Chinese retaliation to their lucrative businesses in the PRC. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on some of these developments. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Tuesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.